Hello, everybody. Welcome to another segment of the Pivoted Success podcast, hosted by our friend Sean Cochran from TCC Canada and myself, Jared Goldsmith from eSAX Virtual Events. It's my pleasure today to welcome award-winning writer, journalist, speaker, author of 4 books, including his latest, The Soul of an Entrepreneur, David Sax. David, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be the D-Sax on eSAX, Jared.
No coincidence. But it is a funny take on life. David, it's a real pleasure to interview you. I've had a chance to read this book, loved it. So let's talk a bit about your background. Who are you and what are you all about?
Sure. Thank you. I am a writer and journalist based in Toronto. And I've always kind of focused on entrepreneurs, small business as the focus of sort of my writing when I was writing for newspapers and magazines. And then later on when I was writing books, I've written a number of books. This is the 4th, but they all looked at different entrepreneurs and small businesses, whether they were Jewish delicatessen owners or individuals who own restaurants or companies in the food business, or even record store owners and people who are starting film companies. For my best-selling book, The Revenge of Analog, it was rarely focused on large corporations. I was always interested in the entrepreneur because I guess that's how I saw myself. I've always been freelance. I've always been self-employed. My parents always worked for themselves. Many of the people I know in my family, they've all worked for themselves, started businesses. My wife had started a business a couple of years ago. And so I wanted to see what, really was behind the reality of being an entrepreneur versus the sort of mythology, which is what a lot of us had really been hearing about or talking about over the previous decade or so.
Sure. And that really came clear in the book. There's a big divide about the Silicon Valley hero entrepreneur myth versus the small business myth. And this is, my bread and butter. I'm dealing with small business all the time. That's why I'm really attracted to it. You mentioned your father really quickly. There was a quote in the book that he referred to entrepreneurs as the equivalent of wild animals. Unattainable, untamed. And so let's talk about how you were affected by COVID, David, as a writer.
Oh, well, this book came out in April of 2020. So, when you write a book, I mean, every time it's like launching a new business. You get a little money up front from the publisher, but your hope with each book that you write is that this is the one that's going to be the success that catapults you into the next strata of literary sales genius. And the better a book sells, the better other opportunities come. You might get opportunities in film or podcast or TV series, foreign rights, speaking, which is where I made most of my money prior to the pandemic. And so in those early days when the book was released, I mean, it was falling on, I wouldn't say deaf ears, but ears that were occupied by other screams of the reality of the pandemic's early days. We're talking about April of 2020, right? This is really at the beginning of everything. Everyone's locked in. The last thing people are doing is going out to bookstores because they're closed. The bookstores are quite literally closed. There's no book tour. And so it was very interesting because on the one sense, it was kind of like, all right, well, so much for this. And the other sense, there was more of an interest all of a sudden in these small businesses and the real fate of entrepreneurs around the world, because they were the ones who were really feeling the brunt of the pandemic and have continued feeling it right away. And so we walked along our streets or drove along the streets of our cities and towns. And all of a sudden we were seeing that businesses that we knew and loved were really threatened. We saw, restaurants and bars and stores all of a sudden covered with brown paper. And we reached out and, bought gift certificates because we wanted them to survive. We had been thinking so much about entrepreneurship in this big sense. How can we create the next Shopify, in Ottawa, right? Well, it's going to be the next one. But we never really considered the centrality of all of those entrepreneurs and those small businesses to our community and our life, and suddenly they were threatened. So I was writing and speaking about that quite a lot, actually, because there was interest in this all of a sudden.
Right.
So yeah, the direct financial effect on me was pretty obvious. The book was not going to explode into the bestseller list. It'd be very hard to get people to even hear about it. And my main source of financial income, flying to conferences to speak to people, just fell off a cliff. And so it was this strange, dichotomy, which typifies kind of life as an entrepreneur. It's like you took the risk, you rolled the dice.
Yeah.
And this time, some piece of bat DNA had something to do with it, but who knows, right? It's just, that was the black swan event. Maybe it was a black swan that got sick, coughed on someone. I don't know.
So for you, David, I mean, I guess that was a pretty drastic shift because, I mean, for a book launch, it would be pretty in person with a book tour and all that exciting stuff that comes along with it. So for you, what were you able to do to try and pivot to get to your audience, especially in, honestly, one of the worst times ever in my experience, when everybody else is freaking out, losing their minds about the world ending?
Yeah, well, there was definitely a good 2 weeks of the freaking out. A lot of deep breathing, a lot of drinking. But I think it was eventually saying, okay, well, this has nothing to do with me. I did what I could. I wrote my book, and these are the circumstances. So what's the best I can make of it, right? How can I take the events that I had already booked at these various bookstores and libraries around North America, and could they do them online? And so we worked with the publisher and the bookstores and the libraries and these other institutions, and we did events like this with hundreds, thousands of people, some of them around the world and online. And the speaking agency was able to book me to speak to chambers of commerce and different business groups about entrepreneurs and folding in the reality of the pandemic and what we've learned about it. And do that, through this method. The book launch was sad. I mean, it was this with a glass of wine. Nobody wants that. But that's the reality, right? And, next time when my next book comes out, this coming fall, hopefully I'll be able to have that wine in person in a store or at a library or touring around and seeing it. And so, it was definitely a sense of making lemonade from the lemons that everyone was given. There wasn't, I mean, in the good sense, I was still able to do a lot of what I was able to do, right? I was thankful that I wasn't running a fine dining restaurant. I was able to keep writing because that's something I'd always done remotely from home since the day I'd started. I was able to start working on a new book and come up with new ideas. And that experience of the past 2 years is actually the basis of what the new book is about. And so I was fortunate that I had the time and the freedom to deal with that. I also spent a lot of time just being with my kids and dealing with homeschool and the poison chalice that was, which again, I was fortunate. Not that anyone would refer to that experience as fortunate, but I was fortunate in the sense that because I'm an entrepreneur, because I'm self-employed, because I had no boss saying, well, you still got to be on the conference call at 9 a.m., David. And I wasn't working in a bathtub like my friend Melanie, literally like cushions in a bathtub, hiding from her children. I was able to say, okay, for the next 3 months, until the fall, I'm going to do as little as, I'm focusing on this. Or the summer, I said, my kids can't go to summer camp. I have enough money saved that I can take the summer off. I'm going to take the summer off, and I'm going to camp dad, and we're going to do stuff every day. And we had a fantastic time. And that was a wonderful experience. And so part of that joy of being the entrepreneur, at least the way I have done it, where I don't have a business, I don't have employees, was I had the freedom. Right. And so, that was as much a part of it as figuring out how to make up the income that I lost, which in a lot of ways I did.
Right. I mean, we could talk at length about the tenacity of small business in particular versus, the Silicon Valley folks. But there's so much I want to say, David. I wish we had more time here. In terms of your writing, like, you have done an incredible amount of research in person in many cases through this book, The Soul of an Entrepreneur, going to all of the different venues, ranches, etc. How is that affected now that we cannot travel as easily? Like, are you having an opportunity to have, say, some of these interviews more virtually? Like, are people more willing to give you 5 minutes of their time instead of flying down for 3 days?
So I just finished writing. I mean, literally a minute before we got on the call, I finished editing the second draft of my new book, which is coming out this fall. It's called The Futurist Analog, and it's a follow-up to the book that was previous to Soul of an Entrepreneur, called The Revenge of Analog, which is a international bestseller, huge, #1 in Korea. And it looks at the experience of the pandemic and what we've learned about the sort of promise of the all digital future. And I wrote it over the past year, and every single interview was done either on phone or on Zoom or some other platform. And so it was very easy. I did, almost 200 interviews, and it sucked. It's terrible, because this gives you the basest sense of conversation and understanding, but there is nothing compared to the reality of going somewhere and sitting with someone over the course of 2 days and touring their farm with them, or going to their factory, or speaking with them in their home as they're having dinner with their family, and getting that full understanding of all the circumstances and setting that gives you a deeper sense of information about what you're trying to research.
Right.
This is the reason why I'm a writer. This is the reason why I'm a journalist. This is why I do what I do. I don't like sitting at home typing on a keyboard. I don't mind it. I'm pretty good at it. But if you said that this is the rest of the future, every interview you're going to do is virtual, I think I would find another field to work in. And so in a way, it was much more efficient. I didn't have to figure out when I was going to go to New Hampshire and book a flight, and how that was going to work out with the trip to New York, and who I would speak with there, spending, I don't know, a night trying to deal with the Airbnb that happened to be above a bar. And I didn't realize it, as I had when I went to Rockaway, Queens, to research, one of the chapters of this book. But I also didn't get to go surfing with the person I was writing about and describe what it was like to see the dolphins jumping as we biked along the boardwalk at 6 a.m. And that was about her life as someone who decided to open a lifestyle business.
Was the Rockaway outside of New York on the beach resort?
Yeah, I mean, beach resort is a stretch. It's still New York City.
Yeah.
It's like the drive-in from LaGuardia with an ocean. But yeah, this was, she wanted to live in New York. Tracy Balsky, she was a chef in Manhattan, a pastry chef, high stress, all the horrendousness of being a female chef in a male-dominated industry, low pay, sexual harassment, all that. And was just sick of the grind, and got into surfing and moved out by the beach. But you could still take the subway into Manhattan, and decided to open a bakery of her own there. And this she had done a couple of years ago, and was successful in the sense that the bakery was good. It made money. She was able to live by the beach and surf every morning on her way to the bakery. And she worked extremely hard, but she got to enjoy her life rather than just sort of hoping for some sort of retirement. And so to really get the sense of that, you have to go and actually see that, right? Experience every moment of it, from, waking up in the morning to go surf with her at sunrise, which was, no difficult thing, but also sitting there in the bakery as she, carried jugs of water and kneaded croissanto, which is not a romantic thing. I mean, it's a physically taxing
It's a big part of the
experience,
business in that case,
right? Dealing with random people from the street coming in and asking for money, and sort of observing that full reality of what an entrepreneur's life is like. And I think that to me was the most important thing, because the subtitle of the book is Work and Life Beyond the Startup Myth. And I think the mythology of the entrepreneur over the past 15, 20 years has been this sort of godlike Silicon Valley figure, that someone has a brilliant idea and money rains down from the sky and everything's great. And they retell their story on podcasts or on the stages of, some inspirational conference. And they have a couple pithy sayings about, never give up and always try your hardest and don't let anyone tell you and blah, 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 blah. And don't doubt yourself and blah, blah, blah. And everyone's like, yeah, woohoo, rah. But the reality of it is that it's difficult and it's long hours and it's frustration and it's fights and it's divorces with spouses and with business partners and lawsuits and, dealing with like rat infestations in your sexy restaurant and dealing with, products that actually fail and don't work and dealing with bankruptcy and dealing with these difficult things. And it's the highs and the lows that happen every day. That's the reality of every entrepreneur I have known, whether they are large, financially successful entrepreneurs that have done tremendous things and own gorgeous houses, or whether they're someone who owns the local business that you go to every day for your coffee.
I mean,
or
we see it all the time, like the journals, the newspapers, the business sections, they're always showcasing the multi-million dollar, the high exits, the funding round A through Z, whatever. I mean, I would think, and I've been thinking this for years, but you really put it into perspective in this book, that the solopreneur adapting to COVID, the one-person shop who's taking their side hustle, trying to keep their business alive during COVID, they couldn't care less about the multi-million dollars. They're raising huge capital and everybody saying it's easy to fail when they have their house on the line.
Yeah. And that cohort of entrepreneurs that we're talking about, there was two academics from University of North Carolina that wrote a paper, which was talking about in the journals of entrepreneurship, in the academic study of entrepreneurship, which is a huge growing field, around the world in academia, universities, business schools, 90% of the papers or something like that, maybe 50% of the papers were written about, venture capital and funding rounds. But that actually represented like less than 1% of all businesses that had started. So, if you open up the newspaper, if you open up the business pages, if you look online, if you listen to every podcast about entrepreneurs, and I was, on a bunch of podcasts about entrepreneurs and listening to them for some time, 90% of them are focused on so-and-so started, Allbirds or this or that, or this company, this sexy company, and, got this round of funding and that. It's like, that is, the academic said, this is like, imagine if 50% of the papers by biologists were elephants, even though elephants are one of the smallest species in terms of biomass and population in the world. The majority of entrepreneurs are like the other 90% of the biological species in the world. Ants, termites, fleas, flies, microbes, viruses, right? Which actually have a much bigger impact. An elephant doesn't have any impact in our life. An elephant is beautiful and tremendous and powerful and sexy. You can sell a stuffed animal with an elephant to any kid. You go to the zoo, you're going to build your exhibit around the elephant. Nobody cares about the ant farm that happens to be at the zoo, but the ants in the real world have a much bigger impact and are much more important for the health of the soil and the ecosystem than the elephants are. Nothing against elephants. I certainly don't condone poaching or anything like that. Just go to my ivory piano back here. But that's the disconnect of reality that drove me to write this book. It's like every single thing I'm reading about entrepreneurs is talking about this one tiny subset of entrepreneurs who are the outliers, the absolute outliers.
I mean, how many Steve Jobs are there? Elon's out there. I mean, to me, it's like entrepreneur porn. It's so far from reality.
Yeah. That was the name of a Harvard Business Review article that I read, which really kind of captured it. It's this complete and total disconnect from reality of what being an entrepreneur is all about. And being an entrepreneur can be a wonderful, incredible, gratifying, liberating thing. We need people to go out and create new ideas and take those risks, but we need them to do it for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of different flavors and motivations. And we have to acknowledge what the reality of that is like. And that's what I wanted to get at with this book and tried to.
Yeah, I love everything you're saying, David, about the entrepreneur and just the disparity of what's reported on and what people think of as an entrepreneur. Because, I mean, often you think of this beautiful experience where you get the Ferraris and the mansions and all these things. because some
The Ferraris, plural.
Yes, Ferraris, exactly.
Ferrari. Yeah.
But showering you with this money because, again, you had this great idea and it took off. But as you said, it's one of the outliers. So it's very hard to actually get there. And the struggles that most business people face, especially in our new pandemic age, is just unreal in comparison to the perfect dream of what an entrepreneur might be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there were a lot who experienced that disconnect. I mean, in certain sectors, right? You know, there were the successful restaurant owners who had, you know, hot chef of the year, and they had opened up 5 places, and all of a sudden, you know, reality came and there was nothing. Didn't matter how brilliant or successful you were, how many awards, how many features had been written with you holding your knives like this, you know. If you couldn't open your restaurant, tough luck, right? And it was very difficult to see sort of the pride that people had to swallow in a lot of ways with what they were doing, and for something that was entirely out of their control. But part of being an entrepreneur is accepting that there is always going to be that risk, that something is always going to be completely out of your control. That's in many ways the original definition of the entrepreneur.
I mean, we're touching on the whole concept of mental health a little bit. And you mentioned, at least on page 217, that one's worth is often tied to the business. And the suicide rates for farmers in particular is incredibly high. Like, nobody wants to be in the saddle in that case. How would you suggest that the small business owner can help, at least try to disassociate themselves from their business?
Well, it's a very important and very difficult thing to do, and I think it takes, you know, in a lot of ways, it takes time and it takes discipline, because many of the traits and many of the thinking processes that an entrepreneur needs in order to begin and persevere through a business are often two-edged swords. You know, you have to kind of put your all into it. You have to convince yourself and wrestle with your ego that what you are trying to do, whether you are trying to launch something as a solopreneur, as someone who's just working for themselves, or whether you're actually trying to build something that will grow and employ, you know, many people and expand and take on investment. You have to convince yourself that it's possible. You have to lower those doubts. And in doing so, it does inevitably tie a bit of one's sense of self to the business.
And the family as well. When they're
and
all,
the family, right? That, you know, they get pulled along with that. But I think with time, people realize that, you know, that is a dead end street, right? Because your sense of worth will never be validated by any level of success. You know, as soon as you make $1 million, you want to make 2. And as soon as you make 2, you want to make 5. As you make 5, you want to make 10. You know, Elon Musk is sitting there trying to compete with Lockheed Martin, you know, or Ford. It's never good enough for him. He's, you know, many of these people have churned through families, and it always, again, is that sense of winning. But in doing that, if you can't let go of a certain degree of that, then you'll always lose. Doesn't matter how much you have in the bank account, doesn't matter how well the business is doing, because that uncertainty will always be there. And so after a while, you know, the entrepreneur needs to learn that there has to be some sort of boundary between their life and the business, that it actually is not one and the same, that it's not completely inseparable, that their fortunes are not tied to the business. In a way they are, but it's just simply their financial fortune, right? It's simply that the financial risk they take. And of course, it's going to impact them and their family and their life, but it is not a measure of their worth as a human being. It's not a measure of their worth as an individual, right? There are many successful entrepreneurs who are horrible human beings and whose worth as individuals is terrible. Look at Canadian fashion icon Peter Nygard, now in jail and about to go on trial for, you know, of horrendous sexual assaults. But he did well. He made a lot of money. Does that worth of that individual come from that success? I hope not. I truly don't. But I think a lot of people get caught up in it, and this is the downside of that entrepreneur porn. This is the downside of the glorification and deification of the financial success, right? You get the Nygaards, you get the Elizabeth Holmes. Those are the extreme cases, but how many hot young chefs were terrible to the people who worked for them and were sort of glorified in magazine profiles, and then later that comeuppance came, or successful executives, or the sort of startup golden child of the year. We need to respect more and pay more attention, and maybe raise the profile more of people who have a business for decades and have taken care of the people that work for them and are good examples and stewards of their community. I mean, this is what being an entrepreneur is part of as well, but it may not be as sexy. It may not be as new or sizzling, but that's probably close to the reality and more what we should be talking about.
Yeah, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, entrepreneurship was something that was already a bit of a concern, I think, in terms of mental health and all that sort of stuff. But with the pandemic and these new challenges, and the way you put it earlier, I mean, not being able to anticipate this for anyone. I mean, like you said, the restaurateur who was successful, opened 5 restaurants, everything was going amazing. You don't think there's going to be a worldwide lockdown that's going to shut all your restaurants. So it's not something you can plan for. And as an entrepreneur, I think you're very sort of self-focused on it being your fault when you've made errors in judgment or whatever it is. But when it's something that you truly don't control, it's got to be very difficult to disconnect and say, well, this is the world that's done this to me. So we have to fail at this however much we have to, and then move on and sort of jump out of this, hopefully at the end of it. But what would you suggest for entrepreneurs that are sort of hoping that this is our upswing? I don't want to say that too early, but anyway,
you cursed it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it's like Groundhog Day. You're just like, oh, you saw your shadow. Back to 3 more months of lockdown.
But what words of wisdom would you have for entrepreneurs to sort of maintain and be able to push through and continue? Because I know everybody's sort of fuel levels are pretty low right now after 2 years of this, right?
I think it's that, life is long, right? Ideally and hopefully. And when you read the success stories of people or the failure stories of people, you hear about entrepreneurs. I mean, when I've interviewed entrepreneurs who are older, not in their 20s and 30s, but people who are, in the middle and latter decades of their lives. John Clippinger was a person that I interviewed in the book. He was in his mid 70s. He was starting his 5th company. It might've been more. He'd had careers in academia and research and science and startups that are done well and startups that are not. I mean, the thing about an entrepreneur, and especially someone who's an entrepreneur for life, is that there will always be other opportunities. There will always be other challenges. There's going to be other failures. There's going to be other successes. And that learning from the past is good, but dwelling on the past doesn't really achieve much. The best thing you can do is figure out what you're going to do next, or figure out what the next thing you're going to do is, based, even if it's in the same business. This is kind of what changed my perspective a couple of weeks into the pandemic, as I was sitting there bemoaning, woe is me, that my book would not make an impact and no one would hear about it. And then eventually just like, well, what can I do? Right. I can't go on book tour. I can't do the things that I was planning to do. I can't go and speak at these events that have now been canceled. So what actually can I do? What do I have at my disposal to do? And I think that the businesses and entrepreneurs that we've seen be successful through this time were the ones that actively sort of embraced that as quickly as they could. I think here to Toronto, where I live, and in the neighborhood I live in, there were some coffee shops and restaurants who were like, we're not opening up until we can seat everybody inside, and this is ridiculous, and blah blah blah. This is terrible, and I'm being ruined, and it's not my fault. And it's true, and I can understand their anger, but they close their doors, and they would say like, come in, you don't have to wear a mask. People would be like, yeah, okay, thanks. And then there were others that very quickly, like, we're putting tables out, we're cutting a hole in the window, we're going to have a takeout window, we're going to play music, we're going to start delivering things locally, we're going to team up with this other business, we're going to come up with these new product lines. Like, what can we do? I know what we can't do. Here's what we can do. And that may not make you a lot of money. It may not even make you a profit at all in a circumstance like this if you're a restaurant or something like that, or you're a hotel or a tourist business. But what it actually does is it changes the narrative for the entrepreneur, and it gives them back that feeling of control and excitement over their own destiny, which is the one thing that all entrepreneurs have in common. All entrepreneurs are linked not by money or by growth or by sort of some grand ambition, but by the fact that they like to control their own destiny. They don't want to work for someone else. They are doers. They enjoy coming up with ideas, and they feel energized by the act of sort of taking the reins and going forth. And I think that's the thing that all entrepreneurs have, and they have to do. Whenever things are challenging or difficult, whatever the circumstance, whether it's something like a pandemic, or just, now we're entering an area of inflation, let's say, right? You have no control over interest rates. There's nothing you can do when the bank's interest rates go up. So what are you going to do, right? You can complain about it, you can whine about it, but you can bemoan the sense and fall into that hole, or you could say, okay, what can I do with this, right? What do I have? What skills, what assets, what ideas do I have at my advantage? What is something that I can do? And in taking charge of that, you reclaim the narrative, you re-tap into that kind of entrepreneurial soul, that entrepreneurial spirit, and that gives that sort of sense of energy, that gives that positive feeling.
David, would you say that is a difference between being an entrepreneur and a business owner?
Well, I think I think all business owners are entrepreneurs. I mean, every entrepreneur comes in different flavors. But what do you mean? I'm sorry, Jared.
Well,
I'll let you explain.
As a musician, right, I've been playing for 35 years when COVID hit, and an event planner hosting my events. I realized the world's changed. Sure, we all had a good cry the first day, and then I said, I have to adapt to virtual. I came across this amazing platform, never been busier, had the best years of my life. I'm not going back. But there are other people out there, in the musicians, or my heart goes out to them all. But they're waiting for things to get back to normal. They're waiting for the government handouts, like you said, the restaurants who are waiting until they could open up full. Are they actually being entrepreneurial? Or they just have the idea, the concept, I'm a business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, but it's out of my control, so I'm waiting for things to happen rather than make things happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, listen, I think they're all entrepreneurs, but are there different moments when some are more entrepreneurial than others? Of course. And it's hard, right? There are some people who they had sort of a burst of entrepreneurial energy. They found an idea and they've settled into a routine, and they don't, they're comfortable in that. And it's discomforting, or it's fearful to get out of that. I understand that. But inaction doesn't leads to the same result. What that result is going to be, right? And so, yeah, I think they're entrepreneurs, but are some more entrepreneurial than others? Of course. And I think, yeah, you've seen that with the music business or the events business as well. Doesn't mean they'll be successful. It doesn't mean it'll work. But again, it's that active participation, the sort of active ideas and movement towards something, which is what rekindles that entrepreneurial energy and entrepreneurial spirit.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the values of COVID, let's look on the positive side, is spending more time with the families. You said you took some time off. You did some camping.
How much time, but yeah.
Well, at least a little bit, perhaps more than if life was back normal, you'd be jet setting and speaking all over the world.
That's true.
And talking about the human costs. So in your quote on page 225, embracing failure is projected as a badge of honor, a rite of passage and a prerequisite to eventual success. And then further on, I think it was Nitschke, one of the people you interviewed on page 205, Silicon Valley's startup myth making, romanticized entrepreneurship, glorified risk taker, macho slogans, embracing failure. It rarely, if ever, acknowledged the human cost. Now, because of COVID, I think, would you say that there has been more of a reset? People are realizing spending time with their family is why we're working for the first place, to have that freedom?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you about my friend Chris. Chris owns a restaurant here in Toronto. He's had a long career in the restaurant business. He owned, when he was young in his 30s, he had one of the sort of hottest restaurants here. I guess it was in the 1980s, called Trappers. You know, it was the hot place in town. And then he had another one that, you know, maybe didn't do as well. He spent some time in the Caribbean working at a resort, and then moved back, and has a little bistro in Midtown Toronto called Boland's Open Kitchen. Great little place. He's a sommelier. He's really into wine. And you know, that the stresses of that first, you know, iteration of his career, I mean, it kind of, he says it's what led him to split up with his first wife and his 3 kids, who all moved to the US, and he sees them a couple times a year, if that. But he was fortunate to meet a second wife, and has a daughter who's my daughter's best friend. She's 8 years old. So he's, you know, in his 60s. He has an 8-year-old daughter, but he still runs a restaurant, and it's a chef-driven small restaurant. So he's there, you know, 5 nights a week, certainly on the weekends. And loves his family, loves his kid, great father. But, you know, when you're running that thing, you're running out to the seafood suppliers, going to the wine, you know, making sure the chef there for prep, helping with catering orders. I mean, it's a real hands-on operation. And he said that, you know, those months when he was closed were the best thing that happened to him. With just this Omicron lockdown that happened over the Christmas break, he said the timing couldn't have been better. Couldn't have been happier. Like, yeah, okay, I'll get my money from the government, and it's not great for the business, but like, he's so grateful for that time that he was able to spend with his wife and his daughter from the US to visit. And so, yeah, I think there is certainly that silver lining. I hope that take a pandemic to make the entrepreneur, or make business owners realize that this is something that they should try to actually achieve, that balance is a good thing, that maybe I shouldn't work too hard in the summers. Maybe I should actually spend time with my family and going camping, and, you know, taking my kids out on bike rides. I mean, maybe that's something that I need to build in to the business that I'm planning, or the life that I want, rather than saying, you know, the only thing that matters is the business and everything comes after that. That's a recipe perhaps for financial success, but for life disaster.
And also health issues too.
Yeah. You're going to have a heart attack alone and divorced. Good luck.
How about you, Sean? Anything else you'd like to add?
I was just going to say it's so true, because I mean, in everybody's life, I mean, you get caught up with the hustle and bustle of everything, but entrepreneurs often are really running a little overtime already. So they're already pushed to the limit. So it's rare for them to sort of hit pause and then go and take a break. So everybody kind of got forced into it for the most part. This time around. So like it or not, here's your break. And then you get to sort of reassess your life and take a look at things that almost never would have happened potentially otherwise, right?
I mean, how many entrepreneurs do you know who are like, I've never taken a vacation. I haven't taken a vacation in 6 years. Like, that sucks. That's terrible. I feel awful for you. You haven't taken a vacation in 6 years? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing what you do? I love my work so much. Okay, great. Good for you. Like, clap, clap, clap. But that really stinks. Like, that's, you know, for me personally, you know, perhaps that is true to them and they truly, genuinely love it, and it's their value, and their family's like all on board. That, you know, mom's never on vacation because she's building that business and crushing it. But I do think that this was this great reassessment. And, you know, we hear a lot about the great resignation in the world of the employed. And my wife is a career coach, so I literally hear her making calls and talking to clients every day about their dissatisfaction with their jobs and work. And I think, you know, a similar thought is going on in the heads of entrepreneurs and the self-employed, who can't resign from what they're doing because, you know, you can't quit.
Good to have a paycheck.
You're like, could I get my 2 weeks? And yourself says to them, no, sorry, there's no severance here. But I think they're reevaluating their priorities, reevaluating what is meaningful in life, why they do what they do, beyond just the financial aspect of it. And I think that's the great thing about being an entrepreneur, is that you do have that control. You have the control to decide when you're going to work and when you're not, to some respect.
Well, sure. But as a small business owner, if you're not hustling, no one's hustling. It's like, you know, with my band, they're all contractors.
Yeah.
They go up and they play. And otherwise everything's on my end. If I go for a 2-day camping trip, you know, and I leave my phone at home, I don't know what that's like. I'd be scared to, but no one's hustling. And that's a scary prospect.
But that is a fear that is in many ways a fear of your own, right? The reality is, if you miss a call on a 2-day camping trip for your saxophone band, you will not instantly face bankruptcy. Maybe you'll lose an opportunity for a gig, but I'm pretty sure that if anyone's booking you for a gig over 2 days, they'll be there on the third day when you get back from, your canoe trip.
Sure.
I've had that myself. I've literally like gotten out of the camping trip and gotten into my car and turned on my thing after 5 days. There's an email from 5 emails from the New York Times being like, "Where's your thing? We were editing it. Da, 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 da. Okay, we published it. All right, sorry, I don't know where you are." Like, oh no, I was in the woods. The one thing, but I had a great time. So I think it's that fear. It's that fear of it. There's like a FOMO that entrepreneurs are prey to. And it's that fear of missing out. Whereas you could say, you know what, this is important to me. I want to go camping, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be able to do it without everything falling apart.
Well, there's that the work-life balance. It's easy to talk about, harder to accomplish.
Yeah, and it requires that, putting down of the ego. My virtual event business, or my saxophone business, or my co-working space business, or my writing business is not so important that I can't take this amount of time off. That's an internal conversation, right? Because realistically speaking, and I'm sure your businesses are both very important, like, you could probably take a few days off and they would not completely fall apart.
Right. Well, we're wrapping up our time here. Do you have any words of wisdom, David, for, again, you write books on this sort of thing, but some snippets, words of wisdom for the small businesses struggling during COVID?
I would say that, one is that question of time, right? This is an awful, gut-wrenching time that feels like an eternity, but it is 2 years in a lifetime, and it will pass, and some other things will come after it, and some will be better and some will be worse. And, we have to put things into perspective. And I think the other thing is remembering, what it is to be an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur is not about making a ton of money, although for some it is. It's not about being the most brilliant or cutting edge, although for some people it might be. What links all entrepreneurs together is this balance of freedom and risk, right? You want the freedom to do what you want to do, to create your own business, to work in the way that you want, the hours you want, the fields you want, the wearing what you want, working where you want, setting your agenda and not take it from someone else. And to do that, you must accept a certain level of risk. Financial risk, that no one's going to book the gig, or disease will come and wipe out all your business, or your partner will steal your money, or the market will fall apart, or whatever. But also those other risks that we talked about, the risk to your ego, the risk to your family, the risk. And we have to, instead of pushing those risks aside, saying, I just have to think about the success, the freedom part, we actually have to acknowledge them and accept them into our lives, and be able to balance them, because the risk will always be there and we're always going to have to deal with them. And if you can do that and have that healthy relationship to the risk, rather than just struggling through it till you end up in the hospital, then, your life as an entrepreneur will be better and in balance. And you'll have successes, you'll have challenges, you'll have failures, but overall you'll be able to accept that risk, enjoy the freedom, and get the most of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that risk factor is something that every entrepreneur has to live by.
It's the cost, right? Freedom is the benefit. Doesn't matter how well you do, whether you're successful or not. Every entrepreneur has the freedom to change tomorrow what they're doing. They don't have to ask permission, but the cost of that is the risk.
Right.
And you don't get one without the other.
Right. Well, thank you very much, David. David, how can somebody get in touch with you if somebody wants to purchase, let's say, The Soul of an Entrepreneur book?
Well, they don't need to get in touch with me to purchase it. They can just go to the bookstore, any bookstore, wherever they want it, wherever they buy books. And if you want to get in touch with me, I have a website, saxdavid.com, I think, or saxdavid on Twitter, though I try to be on social media less and less these days, or on LinkedIn. Send me some random invitation on LinkedIn. I always accept, unless it's from someone that says Bitcoin in the title.
Well, thank you so much. On the Pivoted Success podcast today, we were joined by David Sax, an award-winning writer, journalist, and speaker, the author of 4 books, the latest of which is called The Soul of an Entrepreneur. It can be found at any bookstore. And we were joined today by our co-host, Sean Cochran from TCC Canada, and myself, Jared Goldsmith from eSAX Virtual Events. David, stay well, and thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.